Okay, welcome. The Bible and Archaeology, our continuing series. I want to make an announcement, and we were originally planning to continue this up through the Super Bowl, but due to what I anticipate a lot of people wanting to see the big game, what we are doing instead is we're going to not meet here next week, but instead we are going to meet over at our home, and we're going to have the Supper Bowl. So we will begin, we'll still have a Bible study, it won't be Acts, it'll be something a little bit different so that we're not going to interrupt the series. But you're all invited, come over to the Supper Bowl, 5 o'clock over at our place, and we'll begin the celebrations about 5 o'clock. I guess the game starts at 6:30, so our short little Bible study won't overrun the beginning of the Super Bowl, and really invite all of you to come join us at that site. Okay? Okay. Okay. We'll see if we can do that. Make an announcement so that people are aware, heads up, about what's going on. Like I say, we were originally planning to meet on Super Bowl Sunday, but that runs smack dab in the middle of the game, and I know a lot of people want to see the game so that we don't have interference. There will be interference in the game, no doubt, but we won't overrun the... Well, there may be some people, I'm not going to mention who, but some people are going to be rooting for Philadelphia in that game. I've got relatives in Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, I've got some very, very good friends in Kansas City as well, so I wouldn't be terribly disappointed if Kansas City wins. Every time I've gone to Kansas City and meet those people, they give me a new Super Bowl shirt, jersey, hat, things of that sort. So, like I say, those people are very dear to me. And so, at any rate, join us at the Supper Bowl, and then the week after Super Bowl, we will meet here as regularly scheduled. So, like I say, we want to continue with our series of the archaeology in the Bible. Last time we studied Acts chapter 15. Today we're going to get into the first part. We're not going to cover all of chapter 16, but we'll get into the first part of Acts chapter 16. And that is Paul's mission to Cilicia and also Galatia. You may recall that Paul and Barnabas ministered and established churches in Galatia earlier in Acts chapter 13 and 14. This is when Paul and Barnabas, actually it's going to be Paul and Silas, go and revisit those churches. But prior to that, they also go and visit some of the churches that Paul established in Cilicia. So let's just remind you of what we finished with last time in Acts chapter 15. You may recall that Paul and Barnabas went down to Jerusalem for what is called the Jerusalem Council. And that is because there were people called Judaizers who had gone all the way up to Antioch and to the Gentiles in Antioch, and were telling the Gentiles that you cannot be saved unless you are circumcised and obey the Mosaic law. Okay? And that, of course, was really quite a problem because the Gentile people have never read Torah, the Mosaic law, and they were uncircumcised. Okay? And so the Jerusalem Council is where they met together to deliberate and to debate the issue. And then at the conclusion of the Jerusalem Council, Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and others go up to Antioch, share that news with the congregation at Antioch. And then at the very end of chapter 15, I shared this in our parting moments, Paul got together with Barnabas and said, hey, it would be a good idea for us to go back to these churches that we established and see how they're doing, continue to teach them, help them out, and continue with the ministry. Barnabas wanted to take John Mark along with them, but if you recollect, in Acts chapter 13, John Mark split. Okay, he was not willing to go with them over the Taurus Mountains into Galatia for a variety of reasons. And that really hamstrung the mission. It made it very difficult for Paul and Barnabas. They persisted. The mission was very successful. But when they get together now, at the end of chapter 15, Barnabas says, okay, let's take John Mark along with us. And Paul objects to that. Okay, we need dependable people, and Mark's split. We can't have this going on again. And so they debate the issue. There's an argument, and all arguments aren't bad, okay? Because really we can see how God uses an argument, a debate of this sort, for good purposes. Because what ultimately happens is that Barnabas teams up with John Mark. They happen to be cousins, and they happen to be Cypriots. And so they go back to Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, and continue to minister to the churches that they established on that first mission there to Cyprus. Paul, on the other hand, teams up with Silas, and they head overland to, and I want to direct your attention to verse 41 in yellow on our screen here. They were traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. Okay, now what's important here is that word strengthening. They're not establishing churches. These were churches that were already established. You'll notice on the first mission to Cyprus, Pamphylia, and to Galatia, they didn't go anywhere near Cilicia. Okay? Now, as they depart, Paul and Silas overland, they go to Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches that were established there. I'd mentioned this to you before. Okay? Shortly after Paul's conversion, he went back to Cilicia, to his hometown in Tarsus, and spent 7 to 9 years there. During that time, he established these churches, which Paul and Silas now visit. Let's give you some geographic orientation. As you can see here, this is what is today called Turkey. Sometimes it's called Turkey by people who don't know that the name has changed somewhat. And if you look down to the bottom of the screen over on the right-hand side, that's the area that we're most concerned with. Okay? So here on the red line, I show you the route that most probably was undertaken by Paul and Silas on that journey at the beginning of chapter 16. They took off at Antioch at the very bottom of the screen, went north, went up through Issos. Some of you may recognize Issos. A great battle took place at Issos. Let me see if I can zoom in a little closer there so you can see that. All the way up to where they first turned to the west, you can see the name Issos there. And this was, like I say, a very famous battle where Alexander the Great defeated Darius III, continued to push the Persians out of not only Anatolia, but basically wiped them out as a factor in terms of world powers. He continued then further to the west through the city of Adana. Adana today is one of the largest Turkish cities. It was also called Adana back in Paul's day. And then from Adana, you can see all the way over on the left-hand side, you can see the city of Tarsus. As you know, of course, Tarsus was Paul's hometown. Okay? So these are some shots from Tarsus. Question, Paul?
Can Tarsus be reached by boat?
No longer. Now we're going to see the Kudnis River, and we're going to show you some pictures of that in just a moment. But because of that, the area has been silted up and is no longer accessible from the sea. Okay? Here what you see is a street that dates back to the time of Paul. You can see that it's got a sewer underneath. It's got gutters on the side. You can see it's colonnaded on both sides also, so there were shops here. No doubt Paul spent a great deal of time on this street and many other streets. Tarsus today is a city of some 400,000 people, so it's a large city, and it sits on top of the ancient city, so not a great deal can be seen, but this is a nice piece of road. It's one city square block which has been excavated and revealed. Elsewhere in the city, you can see off into the distance some modern buildings, but over onto the right-hand side, or left-hand side, and in the center of the picture, you see Roman baths that have been preserved and have been somewhat excavated. Elsewhere in the city, you see this structure, which is really quite puzzling to archaeologists. We really don't know what it is for sure. It's called the Danuk Tosh. Some people think that was a massive tomb. Problem is, there's no tombs that look like this. Other people think it's perhaps an ancient temple, but again, the problem remains. Temples don't look like this. So what was it? Well, we don't know, but it's a massive structure. If you climb inside, which I did, as you can see some of the interior of it, and it's just a very interesting and peculiar structure that existed during the time of Paul. No doubt he saw the Danuk Tosh, and if he were here, he could tell you what it was. There is an entrance, and the gate is usually locked, but there's also a way to climb around on the backside and to get up and over and into the Danuk Tosh. So I've actually gone in by climbing, but there are other times when I've been able to get in with someone who's had the key to unlock it. So it's an interesting structure. These are the remains of a Roman bridge over the Kudnis River, which Paul had asked about. These remains are actually in a jami, that is a mosque. And the river used to flow through here, but the course of the river has changed, and so the course of the river now flows through the ancient necropolis. This is actually the cemetery, the tombs of Tarsus, and now you can see the Kudnis River as it flows and makes its way to the sea. Okay, so once Paul and Silas arrived at Tarsus, where did they go next? Okay, what are the possibilities on the road? Many scholars believe that Paul and Silas went north. And so let me show you again, zoom up into the map here, through what is called the Cilician Gates. This is an area of the Taurus Mountains, which you can see to the north here. Taurus Mountains are very steep, very difficult to climb, but this is a mountain pass, which is a possibility as to where it is that Paul and Silas would have gone. This is where, for instance, Alexander the Great made his way as he was, again, conquering the territory further to the east. Likewise, the Persian armies led by Cyrus the Great came through the Cilician Gates as well. So that's a possibility because we do know that there was a Roman road. As a matter of fact, this is the Roman road. I've traveled on this Roman road several times that leads from Tarsus all the way up to the Cilician Gates and then past the Cilician Gates up into the interior. Another picture of that Roman road. And if we go further onto this Roman road, it's amazing really that this road has been preserved for as long as it has been. It's about a mile and a half to 2 miles, somewhere in that range that you can walk today. And then after that, I've continued to follow that road in the direction in which it was finally leading, but it disappears, and I followed it probably for another mile and couldn't find the road re-emerging anywhere. But this here, you can see that it's got an S-shaped turn in the road, and the reason for that is because the road passes through a small village. We don't know the name of this small village, but there are some structures there, scant remains of structures that existed there. This area, of course, is wind-blown, kind of wind-blasted, and has been such for the course of 2,300 years, and so there's not much that remains here that can be seen. Continuing from there, you go to the Cilician Gates. This is called Gulek Kale today. Up at the top, perched on a piece of rock, you see some knuckleheads standing here, but you can see also the road, that modern road actually, that follows the road that Alexander the Great, Cyrus the Great, and others would have taken as they made their way through the Taurus Mountains. Instead, I think that what Paul did is he continued further to the southwest. And the reason for that is Paul spent 7 to 9 years in Cilicia doing ministry. And if he's going to go through Cilicia, I don't think he's going to bypass these churches that he established. Paul has a habit of not only establishing churches, but he maintains connection with these churches. He maintains connection many times by writing letters, but he also, in as much as possible, he travels, goes back to these churches, addresses some of the questions that they've got, addresses some of the problems that they're dealing with. And so I cannot imagine that Paul on this second mission, even though we know, this is what Acts chapter 15 tells us, verse 41, he was traveling through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So rather than going north from Tarsus through the Cilician gates, I think it's much more probable that he continues further south into what is called rough Cilicia. You'll notice there, you can see the labels on the map there. In the middle there you see Cilicia Petios. That translated simply means smooth Cilicia. That area of Cilicia has a delta where a lot of these rivers have brought alluvial soil down from the mountains, and so you've got good fertile land, and so that's called smooth Cilicia. But when you get further to the left, further to the west, you can see there it's called Cilicia Trachea, which translated simply is rough Cilicia. And it is brutally rough, very hard terrain to travel through, and that's where I think Paul did a lot of his ministry. Paul probably visited this site. It's called Chataorin. Okay, there is a synagogue there. You can see the lintel, and then on the lintel you can see a 7-branched menorah indicating a Jewish presence. I wrote an article on this for the Biblical Archeology Review in 2012. If you're interested in reading that, learning more about what was going on at Chataorin, check out that article. It's on my website, so you've got the PDF that you can read in its entirety. So I'm certain Paul would have visited this church because, again, Paul has a habit of visiting, and I mentioned this to you before. Paul goes to places where there were Jews because to his dying day, Paul believed that the Jewish people were the people, the covenant people, the chosen, the elect people who were charged with a mission to in turn share the gospel with the rest of the world. They are a priestly nation. And so that's why Paul always goes to the synagogue first. Paul may have also gone to this village up into the mountains called Adam Kaelar. Spectacular sight because on the mountain face, actually the cliff face, you see soldiers armed with spears, with the gladius, that is their sword, indicating to anybody who makes the trek, the journey into the interior, that we are here to protect our families. Tek-Kadden, another terrific sight. Again, you can see, this is my drone, so I'm shooting down. You can see some of the caves, some of the dwellings. Even on top, you can see some of the structures that were constructed for people who dwelled there, who lived there some 2,200, 2,000 years ago. These are the areas where Paul would have traveled. What we've got here is a very well-preserved aqueduct, bringing mountains from further into the Taurus Mountain, bringing water from the Taurus Mountains into the locations closer to the shore. This particular aqueduct brings water to the city of Eleusis Sebast. Churches, of course, we have many churches, and many of the churches that have been discovered today, that you can see today, are some of the earliest churches you can find anywhere in the world, dating back to the 4th century. You may recall that prior to the 4th century, prior to the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, nobody built churches because the church was an underground movement. Christians met in homes. So you didn't have monumental structures of this sort. Christianity survived, discreetly sharing the gospel with others. But once the Edict of Milan was issued, of course, you had churches built, and you see numerous churches plastered all over this area of rough Cilicia. This is one of my favorite sites because it is just terrific. It's so scenic, and there's so many ruins here. This is a place called Tabarelli. We don't know the ancient name, but there is an inscription here that makes reference to Bimissos. And so it's quite possible that this was actually the ancient city of Bemissos, located in the canyons, the Lamas River Valley canyons. And you can see a tremendous amount of brush that has enshrouded all of these ruins. In one sense, I wish it could be cleaned away so you can see much better what was going on. And you can also see that it's built not only on the top of this huge precipice that sticks out into the gorge, but also drops off in incredible ways. So like I say, it's quite a beautiful place to visit, but you also have to watch your steps a little bit. Again, we see another structure here at a place called Karakabakli, among the places that Paul may have visited, may have established churches and done ministry. One of the unique characteristic features that you see in Rough Cilicia are watchtowers. And it's not unique because there are watchtowers in other places around Turkey, but the number of watchtowers in Rough Cilicia is staggering and amazing. Okay, more than 40 of these in a short cluster, indicating, of course, that the people were very much concerned about intruders coming up from the coast. You can see from this watchtower, you can see the Mediterranean Sea off into the distance, and then the watchtower, of course, guarding and being there to communicate to others of threats that may be coming. If you walk inside one of these towers, this is a different tower. This is called Occam Tower. You can see that the interior, of course, has disappeared. There would have been floors, as many as 3 and 4 floors, made and constructed of wood. Wood isn't going to last, of course, for 2,000 years, so the wood has collapsed, but you can see what the interior would have looked like, a lot of the windows, and then you can see, of course, up at the very top, the sky. Another very interesting and fascinating feature in this area are the caves, and caves built into cliff faces. Why do people build structures such as that? It's because they are afraid of the intruders, the people who are coming there to rob and to steal, to kill, to harm, and to take the residents as slaves. And who would those people be? Pirates. We've talked about that before. I'm not going to elaborate on that anymore. But as a consequence, many of these people were living in places such as you see here. Now, I want to introduce you to some of the residents of this area. And, well, as you can see, a colorful gecko. I've never seen a gecko like this before. Of course, I don't see many geckos as it is, but I thought, man, that guy's beautiful. And then, of course, what you also have is the Turkish mountain viper. And there are a few of them that I have encountered, so you need to watch your step. And then, once again, just another fascinating site called Maidinkali, which was settled back in the Hellenistic period. It's possible that Paul could have been here as well. A lot of structures out and around it also, but it overlooks one of the mountain valleys where some of the rivers flow, cutting these gorges that you can see, some of these canyons leading out into the Mediterranean. Okay, so let's get into Acts chapter 16. Like I say, we're only going to cover about the first half of chapter 16. And so Paul teams up with Silas. They take off. They go through Cilicia. They go through Rough Cilicia. And from there, chapter 16, verse 1 says, Paul came also to Derbe and to Lystra. You may recall Derbe and Lystra. Okay, they are cities of Galatia. Those are the two last cities, of course, that Paul and Barnabas evangelized on that first mission. So now they're going the opposite direction. And so Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra, and a disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. And he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Okay? So, again, taking our map, tracing where we're going, or where they were going, I think what happened is Paul from Tarsus made his way down southwest, all the way down to the Roman city called Seleucia ad Calicadnum. Calicadnum is the river there, the Calicadnus River, that is one of Turkey's largest rivers, and it flows through Turkey, making its way through the Taurus Mountains and into the Mediterranean Sea. So I think it's probable that Paul and Silas made the journey up the Kalykadnas River for a stretch, probably a good stretch, because this is, again, another one of the openings in the Taurus Mountains where it's possible to get into the interior. And from there, of course, we have some projected roads that would take him further up to Derbe, and then from there on into the interior. So here's a shot of the Kalykadnas River. Today in Turkish it's called the Göksu. Okay, this is a huge river. Today there's a lot of the waters from the watershed that are being irrigated, and so as a consequence there's not as much water. Still a lot of water, but not as much water as it was in the past. Some of you may be familiar with Frederick Barbarossa. Okay, he led the Third Crusade, and he met his demise here at the Kalykadnas River. He tried to swim across the Kalykadnas River and didn't make it. So that was the end of Frederick Barbarossa. Actually, there's a hotel in Cilicia named after him even today. From there, following the Kalykadnas River for a distance, Paul and Silas then probably made their way north. I think it's probable that they probably walked on this road. This is a road that leads from Olba to Caesarea. It's a Roman road dating back to the time of Paul, in very good shape. Another road that you can see some tombs up on the upper part of the photograph, making their way further north through the mountains. You can see we're up into the mountains right now. This is a monastery that was established during the 5th century, okay? It's called Alahan Monastery. It's a little bit north of the city of Mut, okay? It became a pilgrimage site. It also became a monastery, and it's really quite a terrific site. And the scenery from there is terrific as well. You can see there are mountains that you can see off into the distance. Another shot of the basilica, the primary basilica at Alahan Monastery. Of course, Paul and Silas made use of Roman bridges because there are going to be times when they have to cross some of the rivers, some of the tributaries. And so this is a Roman bridge as well that you can see. Further up into the Taurus Mountains, you can see some of the dwellings of the people who have been removed from the coastal areas, pushed out of the coastal areas and forced up into the interior. And this is a cliff settlement called Godet Sekli Chenet. And you can see all the homes and the dwellings of people stacked up there on the cliff face. I mean, how do you live in places like that? It's amazing. But yet, this is where people retreated once the pirates had seized the coastal areas. And so this is what home is, for that matter. Yes?
Do we know, were the Romans patrolling these roads?
No, the Romans had secured the coasts because the Romans had, over time, the Romans actually built a navy. And as a consequence, they were able to then seize the coastal areas, okay? But the interior, they couldn't get into the interior. And the reason for that is they don't have guns like we have today. They don't have planes like we have today. And for the people who have the upper hand, the upper ground, it was almost impossible to dislodge them. And what actually happened is the pirates had initially secured the coastline once the Romans came in. And the Romans did this 5 times with some of their best generals. They would take the coastal cities. At that time, the pirates would then retreat into the interior. And that's why they were raiding some of these dwellings and some of these towns and villages in the interior. That's why the watchtowers were also built, okay? Because once the pirates were forced out of the coastal areas, they then retreated into the interiors. And the Romans didn't want to mess with that rat's nest because it would be impossible. So then what would happen, I know I'm getting off track a little bit, I apologize. But what would then happen is the Romans, of course, were not able to keep troops there long term. So once the chief armies, the legions, left the areas, okay, then the pirates would come back down into the coastal areas, reconquer the coastal areas, and engage in piracy. And the piracy became such a problem because it was a punch in the gut to the Romans, because this was the breadbasket, okay? The wheat, the oil, the wine, all of that had to travel along the coast of Cilicia, and the pirates were taking it, seizing it. And that's the reason why the Romans did this 5 times. Ultimately, they failed, okay? So addressing the question. At any rate, this is Tashkali. Again, up into that area, you can climb inside of this. You can see how people lived back in those days. This is in the interior. Further, we go to a place called Bin Bir Kalisa. Bin Bir means 1,001. Kalise means churches, 1,001 churches. So we know that Christians settled here. Now, I'm telling you right now, there are not 1,001 churches there. I went there, and there's a lot of them, but they're not 1,001. But it's an amazing site. You can see early Christians dwelt there. You can see some of the churches, some of the structures up into the mountains. Okay, returning then to the text. This is the journey, Paul and Silas, as they make their way into Galatia. Let's return to the text. So Paul, Silas meet up with this guy named Timothy, okay? Son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek, and he was well spoken of by the brethren who were in Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted this man to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him. Why? Because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So they were passing through the cities. They were delivering the decrees which had been decided upon by the apostles and the elders who were in Jerusalem for them to observe. So the churches were being strengthened in the faith and were increasing in number daily. Now the question is, okay, let's go back a week. Jerusalem Council, okay? You have these people called the Judaizers who are insisting that Gentile Christians cannot be saved unless they obey the law of Moses, what is called the Torah, and unless they are circumcised. Otherwise, you cannot be saved. So the question is then, Paul meets up with Timothy. He's half Jew, he's half Gentile, he's not circumcised. And if circumcision is not necessary, because that's what the decision was, circumcision is not necessary, why does Paul circumcise Timothy? Good question. You know, Paul addresses this issue when writing to the Galatians, okay? And this is the area where Paul is now. He's doing ministry in Galatia, okay? After these Judaizers had gone all the way up to Antioch in Syria, they didn't stop there, okay? They continued from there into Galatia, preaching the same message to the Gentile Christians living in Galatia, telling them, you have to observe Torah and you have to be circumcised. So Paul, after the Jerusalem Council, writes to the Galatians and he addresses this issue, okay? So I'm just going to look, this is really like a real brief, compact survey of Paul's letter to the Galatians. He starts out in chapter 1, I'm amazed that you are so quickly deserting him who called you by the grace of Christ for a different gospel, which is not really another, only there are some who are disturbing you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. So what is this different gospel? What is this distorted gospel of Christ? It's the Judaizers who are adding to the gospel, saying you have to be Torah compliant and circumcised. Later on in chapter 3, this is what Paul says, you foolish Galatians, who bewitched you? This is the only thing I want to find out from you. Did you receive the Spirit by works of the law or by hearing with faith? So then, does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you, does he do it by works of the law or by hearing with faith? A couple of things stand out in that passage, okay? First of all, when the Galatians became Christ believers, they were anointed with the Holy Spirit. That is the definitive sign of salvation. That happened in Acts chapter 2 to the Jews. That happened in Acts chapter 8 with the Samaritans. That happened in Acts chapter 10 with Cornelius, a Gentile, confirming salvation. That happened to the Galatians. And so what Paul is saying to them is, did you receive the Spirit because you were Torah compliant? We don't even have to answer that question. They don't even know what the Torah is. They weren't Torah compliant. They received the Holy Spirit because they believed in Jesus Christ and committed themselves to following Christ. And then there's a second issue here also, the miracles. He says, so then does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you, does he do it by works of the law or by hearing with faith? Did God perform miracles among you because you were Torah compliant? Well, the obvious answer to that is no. Okay? So Paul is calling them back to the true faith. The two issues, Paul addresses both of these issues in the letter to the Galatians. Okay? And we're not going to take all the time that Paul uses. Chapter 3, Paul makes this statement, therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ. The word law here is Torah. Okay? Therefore, the law, the Torah, has become our tutor to lead us to Christ, so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we are no longer under a tutor. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free man. There is neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Paul uses this word tutor. I want to explain a little bit, what was a tutor back in those days? A tutor is not what we think of a tutor today. Today, we think of that word tutor as an instructor, a person who teaches, right? That's not what a tutor was, okay? This is a pedagogos, okay? And a pedagogos was a slave, a household slave, whose task it was is to take the children, to conduct the children from home and bring them to school, to the teacher. The teacher then did the teaching, okay? And the tutor then, this household slave, would then bring the children back home safely. Reason? Kids don't want to go to school, right? If you don't have a tutor, okay, they're going to go to the playground. They'll go to a friend's house. They'll go to the agora. Who knows where they go? They're not going to go to school, okay? So what Jesus is saying is that the Torah is not our primary teacher. Instead, it brought us to Christ. It was to lead us to righteousness. And that righteousness is not found in the Torah. Righteousness is found in the person of Jesus Christ himself. So again, that's just a portion of what Paul tries to share with us as he tells us the purpose of the law. What was the purpose of the law? It wasn't to save us, okay? Instead, it was to lead us to salvation. But now that Christ has come, we're no longer under a tutor. Let's address the second issue, okay, circumcision. So if we get to chapter 5 and chapter 6, what does Paul have to say about circumcision? Okay, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything but faith working through love. A little bit later, chapter 5, verse 12, I wish that those who are troubling you would even mutilate themselves. It's an interesting statement, okay? Because these Judaizers who have come in here insisting that you have to be circumcised, if they're interested in cutting somebody's flesh, let them mutilate themselves. It's interesting because Paul is calling circumcision mutilation. Whew. Again, he's denigrating the purpose of circumcision. Then he finishes up chapter 6, verse 15. Neither is circumcision anything nor uncircumcision, but a new creation. Okay? So in this letter to the Galatians, remember the Judaizers that we talked about last week, okay, had gone all the way up to Antioch and had disturbed the church at Antioch. They didn't stop there. They continued into Galatia with that same message, disturbing the Galatian churches. Paul sets the record straight when writing this. So then let's go back to that question once again, okay? If circumcision is unnecessary, why did Paul circumcise Timothy? Well, I think it's because Timothy could then more effectively minister in synagogues. Okay? Deeply embedded into the minds of the Jewish people is that circumcised Jews are God's covenant people. They are the ones who can bring truth. Those are the people that we can believe in and follow. And so Paul, I think, circumcised Timothy. Now, certainly Timothy was in agreement with this. It's not like Paul tackled him and said, this is what we're going to do. But again, I think it's simply that there's no question, there's no gray area. Let's make this clear. And that as a consequence, you have 3 Jews now in the company traveling together, Paul, Silas, and Timothy. Jews, all of them circumcised. Let's continue with the journey, okay? Acts chapter 16. From there, of course, Paul makes his way through the cities that Paul and Barnabas had earlier evangelized. You can see Derbe, you can see Lystra, you can see Iconium a little bit further to the north there. And this is the journey as they continue. I've been to these places many times. This is a place called Lystra, which is ancient, I believe, ancient Lystra, Lystra, Lystra. And you can see a dwelling there at the place. Here's a church, an early church at Lystra. Moving on from there. Again, we don't know the specific path that they took. They are ministering to many people in many small villages and towns. Luke does not catalog all the different places that Paul and Silas journeyed, and so they could have gone through places like Pincharlik. This is old Isauria. They were actually going through the Isaurian mountains, not the Isaurian, the district, the province called Isauria, and this is up onto the mountain. You can see the tombs of some prominent citizens, perhaps even the kings in Isauria. And then continuing on, making their way all the way to Pisidian Antioch. I mentioned to you before that Pisidian Antioch is different than Syrian Antioch. And you can see some of the dwellings. Work is being conducted at Pisidian Antioch today, and it's very, very well done. I want to finish up then talking about some inscriptions. Okay, and this inscription is at the Konya Museum. Konya is the modern city. Again, it's a large city, about 800,000 people, and it sits on top of Iconium, one of the cities that Paul and Barnabas visited, one of the cities that Paul and Silas visited during this period of time. And the inscription here that I found at the museum is interesting because up at the top you see the words there, slave of God. Slave of God. And then following after that, the last few letters at the top line and extending on to the second line is pragmatutes. Pragmatutes is a manager. You could call him an agent. It's where we get the word pragmatic. And a pragmatutes was a slave, a human slave. But this human slave is describing himself as a slave of God. Now, I find that peculiar and really quite fascinating because this is a theme that we see Paul underscore in his letter to the Galatians. Okay? What does Paul say in chapter 1, verse 10? If I were still trying to please men, I would not be a slave of Christ. Paul's identifying himself as a slave of Christ. A little bit later, Galatians chapter 4, verse 7. You are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, you are an heir of God. Reminding these people, okay, that they are owned by God, are servants of God, and should conduct themselves in such a manner. Paul does this, not as much in some of his other letters. So, for instance, in writing to Titus, Paul introduces himself for that matter. He says, Paul, a slave of God and an apostle of Jesus Christ. As I've traveled around Turkey, I take pictures of every inscription that I can find. So I've got a massive collection of inscriptions. Some of these inscriptions, of course, come from museums, but many of these inscriptions are actually outside in the field, okay? which is a problem, of course, because day by day they're being degraded by the weather. But when you look at some of these inscriptions, and I've collected several of them here, you can see they're tombstones. You can see over on the left-hand side, of course, you see a cross. And right at the very beginning there, you have the words enthata. Okay. We become slaves of righteousness, slaves of God. Again, you can see at Tavium, these are a couple of inscriptions I found at Tavium. You can see a large cross over on the left-hand side, enthata, kata, kite. And then the last three lines, the slave of God. Here below, or here rests the slave of God. Another one over onto the right-hand side, and you see again a huge cross. You can see a secondary cross in the inscription. And then the same terminology, slave of God. Here lies a slave of God. Some of these are anonymous. We don't even have the names of the people. They're not here to talk about themselves. They're here to identify themselves as servants of God, slaves of God. Once again, these are both from Tavium again, which is in the northern part of Galatia. Again, you can see crosses. And this one here below lies the slave of God. And then you do have a name on this one. Theotokre. Theodotus. Actually a feminine, because it's in the feminine case. And then over on the right-hand side, another one. We see many of these in what's called secondary use. One of the interesting things is some of the ancient artifacts, the Turkish people have picked them up and they incorporate them into their own buildings. So lots of times if you go to some of these sites, if there's a village nearby, it's always good to look around, snoop around the village, not that you're peeking in windows or anything of that sort, but you're looking around at the buildings themselves, and you can see some of these pieces from the past that are stuck into the sides of the building. And you can see here, once again, a reference to here lies a slave of God. Another one, here lies a slave of God. Okay, and like I say, you see a concentration of these. I'm not trying to say this is the only place where you see this terminology used, but you see a concentration of these inscriptions making mention and identifying themselves as a slave of God in this letter to the Galatians. The reason Paul emphasizes this when writing to the Galatians. Remember what Paul said when writing to the Romans. He picks up on this theme as well. Having now been freed from sin and enslaved to God, you derive your benefit, resulting in sanctification and the outcome, eternal life. Freed from sin and enslaved to God. If we go to Ankara, Ankara is the capital of Turkey today. It's also an ancient city in Turkey. And they actually have many tombstones that they have placed in an outdoor area, which is a collection of many architectural pieces, including many tombstones. And once again, you can see, again, references to Christians who have passed away who refer to themselves as the slave of God. I think that causes us also, at least it does me, to think differently about how I conduct my life. If you think of yourselves as a free person, in America, of course, we trumpet freedom, don't we? Freedom is so important to us in America. We do our own thing, right? But if we think of ourselves as slaves of God, He is our master. We're to be obedient to Him. And that really restricts our conduct, doesn't it? Causes us to rethink, should I or should I not? How should I act? Would this be pleasing to my master? So I want to close with that. Next time we get together, we'll finish up the rest of Acts chapter 16. But we'll pause at this point, and we've got about 9 minutes for questions, comments that you might have. Yeah. There are passages in the New Testament that talk about the dangers of mingling in secular culture. I didn't bring my Bible with me, but I believe it is James chapter 1. It shares that friendship with the world is enmity with God. And there are several passages like that. Many Christians took that very seriously and said, look, there are just too many temptations that encumber us as we integrate and network with non-Christian people. And so as a consequence, many Christians chose to isolate themselves in communities. And so we have different monastic movements. We have anchoritic Christians or monks. We also have cenobitic monks as well. And they withdrew from society. Some of them withdrew to society to such an extent that they weren't even really networking with other Christians. And they were completely cut off from society. There are other Christian communities that believe that we still have to have a ministry. You know, that we want to isolate ourselves so that we're not living with, but living separately from secular society. But they would be conscientious in terms of periodically entering into communities in order to share the good news of the gospel and to materially help people who are in need. So we begin to see that very early on. We see that at least in the 2nd century AD. So you can go to like Egypt. There's a fellow by the name of Pachomius that you can look up, you know, take a peek at this in the on the internet. And he was a leader of this. And there are many others as well that really undertook this approach to primarily guarding their spirit, okay, and becoming more Christ-like and separating themselves from society to such an extent that they just didn't want to be impacted by it. You know, one of the things that I've shared with my students just almost on a daily basis, it's more likely like a weekly basis, is that culture attacks us in such subtle but increasingly negative ways. You know, we are absorbing culture through every pore on our body. And we've got to be aware of what's happening and realize when it is that culture is tearing us apart from our commitment to Christ. Paul, you had a question. Yeah, good question. Paul asked the question about Roman military presence and what we call colonies also. I think what Paul is alluding to are Roman colonies. For Anatolia, it was basically cut off from the west. Eventually, the Greeks came across the Aegean Sea and began to settle the coastlines. And so we have many Greek cities along the coasts, and then eventually they intruded into the interior, and we see Greek settlements in the interior as well. Same thing when the Romans, and we're talking about the 1st century BC, began to enlarge their empire further and further to the east. And initially, of course, a lot of their colonies were coastal colonies, but they continued to establish colonies into the interior. So speaking particularly of Galatia, Antioch, Pisidian Antioch was a Roman colony. As a matter of fact, Antioch had a temple dedicated to Caesar Augustus. So yeah, there were Roman colonies, and the colonies would be administrated chiefly by retired soldiers. Okay, one of the incentives to enlist in the Roman troops would be that when you retire, you could retire after 20 years and you would be given Roman citizenship. So even if you weren't from Italy, even if you weren't from Rome, you could become a Roman citizen, which is great because no taxes, all kinds of great benefits. And many of those soldiers would then be established as administrators in the colonies. Okay, the problem though is that area of rough Cilicia that I pointed out on the map, the Romans never secured that, never. All the way up until, as a matter of fact, we can go into the Byzantine period and we can look at some of the pilgrims, Agaria, for instance, who made a pilgrimage down into rough Cilicia, still talked about bandits and thieves and the cautions that she had to exercise as she made that journey. We have Roman texts also of people who are basically saying that that was an area that was impenetrable because of the mountains and hostile. And as we have people who are governors there who established their, what would you call it, capital, their residence in Tarsus. Why? Because, and they wouldn't go southwest into rough Cilicia. Reason? Because Tarsus was safe, okay? You go into places like Eleusis Sebast, if you even go to places like Seleucia ad Calicadnos, if you go to Dia Caesarea, you're endangering yourself. You know, there's going to be some problems there. And so the Romans, as much as possible, they would try and get the provincial governors to tax these people. But how are you going to tax these people? You know, and there was always a problem. You couldn't extract taxation unless it was to smooth Cilicia. How could you get taxation out of rough Cilicia? Well, some of the places, maybe you could get something, but it was always a constant problem. So the Romans really never were able to control that area of rough Cilicia. And that's the reason why when Paul himself, I've shared this passage with you before, when Paul writes 2 Corinthians chapter 11, he talks about dangers. And he also says dangers among pirates. The term that is used there, lestes, could be translated as bandits or pirates.
Was the Roman Navy developed as a response to these conditions because the Navy would have quicker access to trouble spots?
It was expanded because of the problems of the pirates. And the pirates weren't only in Cilicia. Okay, the pirates had, at its worst, had taken all of the southern Anatolia cities. All of them, not just in Cilicia, but in Pamphylia, in Lycia, Caria, all of them, okay? And that's when the Romans said, we got to do something. So they expanded their navies. Of course, their navy went back even prior to that with the Punic War, okay? But it wasn't as big as it was in the years thereafter. So, you know, the Romans, the Greeks were known as sailors. The Romans were not. But they were forced to do so because as they expanded their empire further and further to the east, well, they needed to become proficient on the seas.
So I noticed in all the inscriptions that you're showing us that, like within the boundary of the space that they had, the text would go all the way to the edge and start to the next line. And since they don't know Greek, do they cut off in the middle of a word and just continue to the next
Yes,
line?
yes, they do.
Okay.
This is true in even New Testament manuscripts, ancient New Testament manuscripts. They use capital letters. You can see that we don't have it up on the board now, but they're all capitals. Those are called uncials, okay? They didn't develop a small letter script called a minutial until later. The words are run together, so there's no space between words. There's no punctuation. There's no commas, periods, question marks, anything of that sort. And they cut off words in the middle and go to the next line, Okay, so it makes it very difficult. It's difficult to read, first of all, because lots of times, because these inscriptions are weather-beaten terribly, lots of times you can't tell the difference between an epsilon, an omicron, or a theta. Can't tell the difference between a lambda and a delta, or an alpha. So there's a lot of problems there in reading these texts, but you don't know where one word ends and the next one begins, and it becomes a problem. And then throw in another issue, okay, is there's abbreviations. Lots of abbreviations. So some of the inscriptions that I'd shown you actually abbreviate the word God. It's called a nomina sacra. And so they'll have, instead of theou, they just have a theta and an upsilon, and then a bar over the top. That bar over the top kind of alerts you, tells you that it's a nomina sacra. But they have abbreviations as well. So complicated. You've been a wonderful audience. I want to remind you once again, okay, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we will not meet next week because of the Super Bowl, and I know many people want to see the Super Bowl. But, okay, Darlene and I will host a supper bowl at our house. So bring a bowl that you can share with the group. We're going to get together at 5, not 6, 5 o'clock. Super Bowl begins actually at 6:30. That way we can do a quick, short Bible study. So gather together over at our house. And it's open to virtually anyone. It's not just you people. I mean, you people are treasured, valued guests of ours. But bring a friend. So see you next week at home. And then 2 weeks from now, we'll be back here.